The reading today is from Genesis 45, beginning at the 4th verse. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all of the land of Egypt." Here ends the reading.
So don't you just hate it when someone ruins a great story by telling you the ending right in the middle of it? That's what I just did this morning. Before we even hear the second half of the story, we heard the ending or the resolution of that story. But I hope you'll stay with me as we listen to the lessons that we can find from the middle of the story of Joseph. Now, when we last left Joseph, he had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He had been falsely accused by the Egyptian master's wife that he had to serve, and he was thrown into prison. And then he was forgotten in prison by the one person who could have gotten him a chance at getting out of prison. Joseph went through some hard times. And during those times, we learned that Joseph developed some character, some much needed character. When we are first introduced to Joseph, he's kind of a bratty, self-centered teenager with grandiose dreams for himself and not much loved by too many people outside of his parents. But we pick up today as Joseph continues his imprisonment. And 2 years after the wine steward is let out of prison and reinstated into his position and promptly forgets all about Joseph, Pharaoh, the ruler of all Egypt, has had this disturbing dream. And none of his prophets or priests or dream interpreters can tell him what this dream means. And then suddenly the wine steward remembers that while he was in prison, he met this man who could tell him the meaning of the dream that he had had. And so he tells Pharaoh that he had a dream in prison and no one could interpret it, but this Hebrew man was able to tell him the meaning of his dream, and it actually came true. So Pharaoh summons Joseph from prison, and when Joseph appears before him, he says, "I've had this dream which no one can interpret, but I heard that you know how to do that." And Joseph, now this is Joseph's big chance. Like, he has been languishing in prison. Joseph has had 13 years of really, really awful times in his life. And here is his chance to come before the ruler of all of Egypt. And Joseph says to him, "It's not me. It is God who gives the ability to interpret dreams. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable report." This man who once dreamed such great, grandiose dreams for himself, this man who has been betrayed, imprisoned, abandoned, and forgotten, finally gets his chance, his one opportunity to get out of jail, to get a new life, and he says, "It's not me." We hear Joseph express his belief that God is the divine source of dreams. This dream that Pharaoh has had, but I think that Joseph is still hanging on to the fact that God was the source of his own dreams as well. The dreams that he had way back as a teenager. Joseph hasn't abandoned his dreams, but perhaps he's come to understand that his dreams weren't all about personal greatness, but maybe about something else. Maybe Joseph has come to understand that he didn't quite interpret the dream in its fullness. So Joseph does go on to interpret Pharaoh's dream. He says, God has announced to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows in your dream are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears of grain are 7 years. It's actually one dream that you're having over and over. The 7 thin and frail cows climbing up after them are also 7 years. And the 7 thin ears of grain scorched by the wind are 7 years. 7 years of great abundance are now coming to the land of Egypt. And then after them, 7 years of famine will appear. And all of the abundance that Egypt has experienced will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. And then Joseph, rather boldly, begins to give Pharaoh some advice about this dream. He says, Pharaoh should find an intelligent, wise man and give him authority over the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint administrators over the land and take 1/5 of all the produce of the land during the good years. This food will be reserved for the years of famine. Now I wonder, it doesn't tell us, but I wonder, did Joseph have himself in mind for this role? Did Joseph think, I think I could do this. I've been successful in all these difficult places where I've been. We can't know, but what we do know is that in that moment, Joseph did indeed receive the answer to his dreams. 13 years after he is thrown into a dry cistern and sold into slavery, Joseph gets the power and the leadership opportunity that his dreams as a 17-year-old foretold. But along the way, Joseph has learned the purpose of power and leadership. It isn't personal glory. It's the ability to save others. And Joseph goes on to do just that. Now I wonder, did any of you struggle trying to figure out what your purpose in life is or was at some point in your life? Have you talked with your children or your grandchildren as they try to figure out what they're going to do with their life? Sometimes we talk about finding God's purpose for our lives or figuring out God's will, like there's just this one single thing for us to do. But what if our lives are actually more like a story, with chapter after chapter after chapter, each chapter holding its own adventures, each chapter bringing us into a new phase of our relationship with God or understanding ourselves a little bit better? What if our lives are like a story that we co-author with God? That God doesn't simply just say, here's your purpose, go and do it. That God works with us as we discover our gifts and our talents and our passions and our desires. And God helps us to realize some of those things. In that story, we know there will be plot twists, and there will be turns that we didn't expect. There will likely be some very difficult lessons, but there will also be unexpected blessings. Leah and I just celebrated our 36th anniversary this past week. And I'd like to just tell you that our meeting one another was not ever in either one of our plans. When I was a senior in high school, I had my heart set on attending Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. It was a long ways away from home in my mind, but that is where I wanted to go. And the day that I got my acceptance letter to Concordia was one of the happiest days of my life up until then. But the more I thought about what I wanted to study and what I wanted to do with my life, the more I felt like I wanted to teach. And I didn't just want to teach, I wanted to teach deaf children. I don't know where that came from, but that is what I just believed with all my heart that I was meant to do. And Concordia didn't have a program for that. Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota did. I didn't want to go to Augustana. That was not in my plans. Ever since I had started looking at colleges, I knew that I wanted to be a copper. The day I got my acceptance letter from Augustana College, I cried. Because I knew that was where I was going to end up. So that next fall, I packed my things and I landed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And then I realized that I did not want to be a teacher. And that year, Lee also landed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota that year. The girl he was engaged to had just transferred to Augustana College, and he followed her there. So that first year I made some really great friends, and I fell in love with Sioux Falls, and I loved the college, and decided I didn't want to be a teacher and started changing my major. And that same year, Lee got his heart broken by a girl who decided she didn't want to be married to a police officer, which was what he had studied to be. The next year, we happened to live in the same dorm on campus, and we both worked nights. I worked across the street from the college at a home for children with disabilities, and Lee worked in the lobby of the dorm. So every morning when I got off my shift at night, on the nights that I worked and came back to the dorm, he was the one that had to let me back in because the dorms were locked at night. And the next year we were married. And the rest has been our adventure together. We have lived these 36 years aware that God had something to do with our having a life together. And we knew from our very first real conversation that Lee would eventually pursue some type of ministry position. He was already feeling called by God to shift the direction of his life. But 10 years later, when we were already in debt from education, and I said, guess what? I think God has called me into ministry too. Lee said, are you sure? Are you 100% sure that you heard God right? Could he have possibly said doctor or accountant or anything else? That was another unexpected twist in our life together. But that is what life is like. The first part of Joseph's story assures us that even when the unexpected things happen, the disappointments, the tragedies, even the betrayals, even when life wounds us, God is there with us. God does not leave us. But this story also teaches us that it's okay to dream. It's okay to pursue our goals. And when our goals or dreams, our desires, and our passions, when these things are all meant to bring about good in the world, then we know that we are co-writing our story with God, and that our story will be part of God's larger story in this life. Joseph finds fulfillment of his dreams in the land of Egypt, far away from where he thought that would happen. Pharaoh recognizes Joseph's wisdom and makes him his right-hand man. And Joseph is given an Egyptian wife, and before the 7 years of famine comes, he fathers 2 children. Now the names of those children are interesting. The first is named Manasseh, meaning forget, because Joseph says, God has helped me forget all of my troubles and everyone in my father's household. The second child is named Ephraim, meaning fruitful, because Joseph says, God has given me children in the land where I've been treated harshly. These names witness to the fact that Joseph still carries scars. He has been deeply wounded by his own family, by the land where he was taken as a slave. He doesn't pretend that bad things never happened in his life. He doesn't gloss over them, but he also understands that those times have deepened and refined his character and prepared him for the role that he now has. Those scars have become sacred wounds. The names don't simply point to tough times, but also to the healing from those tough times. If the story ended right there, it would be a good story, with the climax being Joseph realizing his dream. But there are actually more adventures ahead for Joseph. He is fulfilling his dreams in the land of Egypt, but that's not the fullness of who Joseph is. He has an Egyptian wife, and he now has children by her, but Joseph is still the son of Jacob, and he has a family that he must come to terms with. And here's where I think we see that life isn't so much like a good book or a good movie. In life, there is always another act. As long as we are alive, there is another act for us to be involved in. I have only said this once before in a sermon, and that time a retired pastor and his wife quit coming to church for 3 months. They were so upset with me for saying this. But as far as I can tell, there is no retirement in the Bible. There is no age at which we can just simply stop doing the work of God in the Bible. Our whole lives are meant to be given to God's work. As long as we are able, God continues to write chapters in our lives with us. My earliest memory of church was Mrs. Mischke. I have no idea how old she actually was, probably is not as old as I thought she was at the time. She had this beautiful white hair, and she had grandchildren, and she taught Sunday school to 5-year-olds for years in our little church. 50 years ago, I was one of the 5-year-olds in her classroom, and I can still in my mind see the hand-lettered sign that was on the wall of her Sunday school room every year. The steadfast love of the Lord our God endures from generation to generation. I remember that sign. And I remember learning some of my very first hymns in that class. And I wonder, how many little kids did Mrs. Mischke introduce to Jesus Christ? How many little hearts did she help form in that classroom? I am still very grateful that long past the time when her own children were grown, Mrs. Mischke still wanted to use her gifts and serve God. Joseph had finally achieved the position of power that he had dreamed of, yet he had unfinished business in his life. Joseph's family suffered from the famine that had come across the land like all other families, and Jacob, hearing of food in Egypt, sends Joseph's brothers there to buy food. Now this is a really long and complicated story that is worthy of 2 sermons in and of itself. But after a lot of cat and mouse and back and forth, Joseph finally reveals to his brothers that it is indeed him. He is still alive. And we hear the words that were from our scripture reading today. Words that Joseph repeats many years later after Jacob's death, when his brothers are still worried that Joseph might want to exact revenge on them for what they did. Joseph says, "You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it in order to save the lives of many people." By seeing God's hand in his whole life, the hard parts and the good parts, Joseph is able to see his story as part of God's greater story, and in that, he finds the grace to forgive and to restore a family that has been torn apart for many years. There's one final thing that I really like about this story of Joseph, one that I didn't realize until I read a book, Sarah Heath's book, What's Your Story? And she writes this: do you notice that God never directly talks to Joseph? Joseph is so sure that God has been acting in his story, and yet there's no burning bush with a voice coming out of it. There's no 3 men showing up to tell him what to do, no grand divine promises that he hears, not even any wrestling with God. Like most of us, Joseph has to look at his life, and he has to figure out how and where God has been present in that life. Joseph co-writes this epic story with God by pursuing good dreams, by growing through tough times, by using his gifts and talents wherever he finds himself, by living faithfully in all the circumstances he finds himself in, and by allowing God to redeem the wounds in his life. Joseph's story took place a long time ago, and it isn't a perfect story because Joseph wasn't a perfect man. But it is relatable, I think, to all of us. The story of Joseph can teach us a lot yet today about how we are writing our own stories with God, how we allow God to be at work in our lives, how we look at the events of our lives, how we meet the challenges that come to us in our lives. The story of Joseph can teach us a lot about how to face the chapters yet to come. Let us pray. Holy and almighty God, every life here today has a story, and every story contains both joy and heartache. It is often only by looking back that we can see your hand in our story. Help us to trust when we are in the midst of unexpected twists and turns, that you are here with us, that you can bring growth and goodness through even conflict and frustration and hurt. Help us be ready to live and act faithfully when our words and our deeds are needed in your greater story. Redeem the wounds we carry, that we might be filled with the grace to forgive where necessary, to be people who bring blessing and restoration in hard places. And help us to be people who look forward, not backward, who prepare for the next adventure, the next chapter, the next possibilities we find in this life with you. As Jesus prayed, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven,